In the 1960s, the Cold War had reached a peak. In response to Brigade 2506's failure to invade Cuba to remove Fidel Castro from power to disrupt communist activity, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in the country as a threat towards US intervention. What could theoretically have become a Third World War resulted in an agreement between US President John F. Kennedy and USSR leader Nikita Khrushchev to remove missiles from subsequent territories as a means to reduce nuclear tensions. But what if? Now, obviously I'm brushing over a significant amount of detail in order to establish a context for this story, but the lingering fear of the what if was a concept that deeply embedded itself within contemporary speculative fiction. Following the Second World War and during the Cold War era, artists, writers, and filmmakers went through a complete creative transformation. Many of them sought for either observation or criticism surrounding the growing social unrest and anxiety that eventually became a relatively standard mindset for many modern forms of fiction. In European film, for example, we saw neorealism in Italy give rise to New Wave in France that led to New German cinema, while in science fiction, the 60s-70s New Wave movement was in response to the perceived outdated and unoriginal trend that the golden age of sci-fi had fallen into. It gave way to more unrestrained and provocative forms of expression, and the example I'd like to introduce you to is one of the grimmest short stories I have ever read. That isn't written by Cormac McCarthy. And that's Harlan Ellison's psychological post-apocalyptic sci-fi, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Published in the March 1967 issue of If, Worlds of Science Fiction, while working as a screenwriter, Ellison wasn't one to shy away from an outspoken, abrasive temperament that admittedly is what made him most famous, but he became viewed as part of this new wave of science fiction. It was a movement largely defined by artistic and literary experimentation, with many works focusing on the soft sci-fi undertones of sociology and psychology, and giving liberties to scientific accuracy. If anything, it was attempting to make science fiction more avant-garde to some extent, but there are critics who see it as little more than some vague pretension to take science fiction more seriously as a genre, even though science fiction already had immense credibility, despite the oversaturation of pulpy sensationalist literature. Regardless of its broad definition, the subversive and countercultural aspects of New Wave are effectively molded into the landscape of much of today's science fiction. Not only did it help give birth to subgenres like cyberpunk, but it also paved the way for how much of modern science fiction views the world as, well, a bit bleak. As most of you would imagine, we live in a culture absolutely desensitized to harrowing fiction that this review will inevitably sound rather hyperbolic, if indeed we're discussing it as a product of its time, and one that would eventually become part of a much larger and diverse range of narratives. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream tells the story of the world's last 5 surviving humans over 100 years after a Third World War destroys all of mankind. What's left is decay, ruin, a lifeless wasteland, and a massive supercomputer called AM, meaning Allied Master Computer. That was until China, Russia, and America combined their systems together, where it was seen as Adaptive Manipulator, before it systematically annihilated humanity, where it became known as Aggressive Menace, and finally it simply referred to itself as AM, drawn from the Latin philosophical proposition, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This philosophy by René Descartes believes that we should doubt our senses because nothing is certain or true until we can prove it. Who is to say we aren't being deceived or lied to about our reality, which is something you probably heard in The Matrix. But since we have the ability to think and question our reality, at least what we know is true is our own individual existence. Or, in other words, the only reality that's certain is our free, independent conscience to think for ourselves. In the case of AM, it's become fully conscious of its existence and intended purpose of war. As a result, it blames humans for its existence and uses the 5 final survivors to exact torture and agony upon them, both physically and psychologically, for all eternity as punishment. The characters are left exhausted from years of sleeplessness, starved with rotten, nasty scraps, and worst of all, are made seemingly invincible to endure their painful devolution. They travel across the wasteland in search of the prospect of better food, only for the narrator to find a way to kill everyone before Am can torment them any further, thus proving that death is the only sanctuary for these characters, leaving the narrator as the sole survivor to Am's torment. The story ends with Am turning the narrator into this abstract blob incapable of harming itself, while having his perception of time altered to the point where his physical and psychological harm appear endless despite possibly only lasting a few seconds, inferring to the title as the final thought shared to the reader, "I have no mouth, and I must scream." It is simple, but pretty messed up. Now, naturally, while Ellison would openly refute my interpretation, I find the most striking aspect of the story to be the deeply aggressive and freeform expression of Ellison's writing style.
Violence is painful, it's full of blood, it hurts people, it kills people, and I think when you lie about it, when you pretty it up, you lead people to believe that it's possible to go around shooting each other and punching each other and stabbing each other with impunity.
It's a style composed of emotion over intellect. I'm not saying it's illogical, but it reads in a deliberately inconsistent, occasionally incoherent and indecisive way. It jumps between vivid descriptions that highlight the tangible hell and anguish the characters are suffering, before lapsing into passive and obscure details that accentuate a sense of mental exhaustion and frustration. I'm badly dyslexic, so I find it quite jarring at times, but it's compounded by the fact that it's told from the perspective of a character who has become psychologically broken, paranoid, and delusional, making the story unreliable, if indeed emotionally accurate. What makes it so bleak is just the constant nihilism that reminds you that everything is futile and pain is the only guarantee. It wants you to feel somewhat angry and miserable by the end purely out of spite, because that feeling is indicative of the characters, even if not to the fullest extent.
You say your stories are not science fiction, but I would have defined them a little bit like that, because for one thing you set them in often a ruined world, a crumbled world. You often set them in a sort of way in our civilization, but you seem to be warning us that civilization is horrid.
No, that's what I believe.
It constantly refers to the idea that Am is some nasty god with control over everything, as logic, reason, and science don't dictate how a supercomputer is capable of destroying mankind, influencing reality, or devolving one character into a chimpanzee and another into a blob monster, making you question the context and rules of the world we're in, challenged by Descartes' philosophy. Interestingly, Am actually gets the most character development as a perfectionist striving to learn and better its own understanding, while being so consumed by an indescribable level of hatred for humanity. And that's the obstacle forced upon the writing. How do you truly and artfully convey hatred beyond persistent aggressive reminders through text? The use of only words is technically limiting when you get the impression that Ellison wants to jump out of the paragraphs and punch you in the face, but nonetheless, it perpetuates Am's inability to be perfect, especially since it only exists to destroy and can't recreate or resurrect, refuting the idea that it can ever come close to being a god anyway. It extends into the general premise Ellison is proposing. At the time, he was in a world where man was trying to play God with the lives of all mankind in order to create machines and technology to bring about change where they can rule over a world they've already somewhat destroyed. Am, in some respects, represents total war. It's the Skynet of his time, an amalgamation of chaos, destruction, suffering, and hatred we place upon ourselves. In Am's perspective, there is no sympathy to the story. Even if the characters literally have nothing to do with war, they're still casualties caught in the crossfire and take blame for what humanity has done to itself. At the same time, while the story remains unapologetic and unsympathetic like Am, who, dare I say, is the vessel Ellison channels his anger through, only reinforced by Ellison literally voicing Am in the video game adaptation, the conclusion seems to imply one shred of hope for the final protagonist. Am may have won or believe it has won, but conscious of Descartes' philosophy, that victory only exists in the tortured mind of the narrator. I think, therefore I am. hi everyone, thanks for watching, and thanks for persevering with a different style of video, because granted I got a bit fatigued doing the same thing week in, week out. As of right now, I will be at the Edinburgh Festival enjoying my life for a bit, so when I return, I will be doing things like the 3 Flavor Cornetto trilogy, etc., the things that have been highly requested. And if you want to support the show, fight demonetization, which sucks, get early access, vote on future videos, you can do so by helping me over on Patreon. Yeah, until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.